American Indian communities are mostly located in rural areas, and until the 1950s, there was limited access to any kind of store-bought commodities. Most Indian families grew much of their own food in family gardens, where crops and livestock were shared with other families. In Oklahoma, many older Indians say that their families were really not greatly affected by the Great Depression because they had their own local food source. In 2012, Haskell Indian Nations University and Kansas State University, on a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, began a research study with two Kansas tribes, the Potawatomi and the Kickapoo. The goal was to create interest and to encourage tribal members to start their own gardens and to facilitate the process.
The project itself was initiated in 2012 and ran for 3 years. I oversaw as principal investigator and was deeply involved in the initial gardening and the planting of produce and crops. The produce that we did put together and planted consisted of things like cucumbers, various varieties of cucumbers, 4 varieties of tomatoes, 2 varieties of cantaloupe, 2 varieties of watermelon, corn, 2 varieties of corn, and we had eggplant. We had 4 varieties of sweet peppers, 2 varieties of hot peppers, zucchini, and squash, 2 varieties of squash. So we put together a pretty significant garden.
The USDA has supplied probably close to, well, certainly $500,000 a year into agricultural programs, and those programs promote better health through better eating, but also using less toxins and water resources, and just having a better environment. Well, the broader scope of the project, the long-term impact, is to get people to eat better foods and to grow their own foods, because gardening is good exercise. So if you're eating better and exercising, then you're much less likely to be overweight and be subject to type 2 diabetes. So this is something they can bring to their home communities.
What I see with the gardening project that we're working on here is that there's over 50 gardens that are tilled every year. That means 50 households can provide some food for themselves, that they don't have to rely on the, GMO or any type of food from the grocery store that they don't know what goes into it. So you've got the healthy aspect, as you know what you're putting in your body. You've also got the exercise aspect, being outside, weeding the garden, taking care of the garden, and it's kind of, like you said before, a return to kind of our traditional past, and it's to me it's huge in playing a role in helping prevent diabetes.
With our Return to a Healthy Past project is our gardening. That's a huge component, is gardening. So Eddie Joe's program, they go out and they not only encourage people to garden, but he goes out and tills their garden. He'll turn it over in the fall. We've collaborated with K-State and Haskell to bring gardening workshops here to let people know that we're here to help them no matter what. If they need help, like elders, Eddie Joe's even gone out and done raised beds because they can't reach over, And
as a part of the project, Haskell planted a demonstration garden to test different varieties of vegetables and to determine their suitability for the local climate.
Yeah, this garden has been very productive. We tested the soil and it was good soil. We had water nearby to irrigate with. We've had a lot of interest in the garden here, and there's an adjacent garden to ours, a traditional garden, and so it makes a nice comparison of the two different gardening styles right side by side. Right, we've done a lot of good work with the Potawatomi. They have a very large community garden, and so we work with the staff up there, and each year they have a harvest festival, a harvest feast in the fall, and we may get 200 to 300 people out for that harvest feast and kind of celebrating the produce and production from the land. And they also are tilling people's private gardens. This was something I believe the Kickapoo started in their program, but they would take tribal equipment and till up people's backyard gardens, help them get into vegetable gardening, help them break that sod for the first time.
It's been kind of cool because we've had this research garden. It's laid out in a very Western science method of straight rows and your different varieties. And then right next to it, we've had the food waste garden, which is more perennials, more traditional ways of growing things. And so it's, from my perspective, it's been kind of cool to see the contrast between the two. And we haven't measured production between the two in a competitive way, but it's just been pretty cool to see the different perspectives on growth.
Historically, this was by no means the first time Haskell students had turned the soil on this site. In the late 1800s, and throughout the first part of the 20th century, when Haskell was a boarding school and then a vocational school, students had the responsibility of helping to farm the acreage around the campus and raise livestock as a food source for the students and staff, and the excess produce was sold to the Lawrence community.
I think let's remember, when the boarding schools were started, and Haskell was one of the early off-reservation boarding schools, the whole intent was to take our nativeness away from us, customs, habits, language, all features of who we are as unique Native peoples. I think what's interesting is that, as you know, in the early years, when this school opened its doors, it was the United States Indian Industrial Training School, and that's really relevant if you think about it, because when they'd send young Native men here, one of the first things they would often try to teach them is farming. Unbeknownst, I think, to the white men who ran the schools, that one, we had thousands years old gardening traditions amongst our peoples. Often these, many of the main responsibilities for gardening went with women.
The concept of American Indians becoming farmers who could sell their produce was a very foreign idea to American Indians, who never regarded the land, the game, or produce as something that anyone could own. Game, fish, and vegetables were gifts from the Creator for their common use. They were generously shared, but never sold for profit.
Of course, there's been a long and sometimes not too friendly history of Haskell being used in the farming days. The old barn still exists where they had the dairy, and the idea that they grew several crops that they used in the cafeteria that was in operation at that particular time. The significance of the growing of foods, again, on behalf of the students, is not so much mandatory, but it's certainly a more volunteer effort. And that's one of the real beauties of it, is because students are able to enjoy it, to be able to see the benefits of it without having it be a mandatory part of their program or their classes, their existence as Haskell.
The project itself was to set up a system of providing different varieties of produce that could be used by and recommended to be used by the different preservation areas, the Potawatomi and the Kickapoo. We worked closely with Kansas State University. Dr. Charles Barden was our contact person. He, along with some graduate students, came down and created the initial garden itself. we planted, and then we were supposed to test and research those items to determine whether those items could be used by reservation tribes and how they would fit in with the climate, or in some areas, like with the Potawatomi-Kickapoo, their area, there are water shortages. The research in the end would result to where we would be able to identify the best cultivars that would be used, could be used in areas that would fit in with the climate.
Haskell and Kansas State student interns were able to compare the use of modern hybrids to older open pollinated varieties at their respective research gardens and greenhouses. The favorability of the older open pollinated varieties was that the seeds may be collected and saved from year to year. Consequently, and as a result of testing and research, the best new cultivars of vegetables were offered as planting options for the Kickapoo Home Gardening Initiative, as was drought-hardy and disease-resistant varieties of pear, chestnut, bush cherries, and plums. These were chosen as a viable option for the Kickapoo tribal members interested in starting mini orchards. After the initial season and the success of the Potawatomi Tribal Garden, Prairie Band Potawatomi tribal employees were chosen and paid with grant funds to act as peer consultants for the Kickapoo, whose gardening development was going at a slower rate.
One of the things that Indian people are noted for with their values and cultural values themselves is the fact that they would always give away. And it reminded me of that's what we did. And we took care of our community. And what we did too was kind of emulate the Potawatomi, is that when we gave our produce away, we talked to them about healthy eating habits. We talked about the problems of diabetes in our communities.